And welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are on to the second Parsha of the book of Numbers, and it's Parshat Naso, and it's actually the longest Parsha in the Torah, and it covers many subjects. And when we left off last year, we were dealing with the subject of the Sotah. The Sotah. The Sotah is a woman who is suspected of adultery, and the way in which that situation is dealt with. And part of it involves the fact that her husband is insanely jealous of her and how he feels, and yet we do not have witnesses. And so what I want to do today is I'm going to deviate a little bit from our regular reading of Chumash and Rashi for me to give an introduction, and I'm going to be reading from this book. This is the Artscroll Mishna, and the one which contains the tractate Sotah and the introduction to the subject of Sotah, because I think that just reading the scriptural text could lead one to a misunderstanding of how Jewish law and tradition understands how this is actually dealt with. And so I'm going to read from this particular section. And this is the general introduction to Sotah. And this is an introduction to the Mishnah, which is the oral law, which according to tradition was given to Moses along with the written law, which is what we're reading in the Torah. And that essentially Judaism is that interpretation of the written law by the Mishnah. And the Mishnah also tries to take what is found in the Torah and to make it something that we live with. In other words, it's basically the repository of oral tradition, oral law, and the purpose of that oral law is to take what's idealistic and which is mentioned in the Torah and actually apply it to the very circumstances of life. That it isn't good enough just to serve God in principle, but to try to serve God in our everyday activities. And so this is got to do with how this particular situation gets applied. So it's going to talk about the tractate Sotah, because the Mishnah is divided into 6 major areas, and then each, which are called orders, Sdarim, and each order is divided into tractates, and the term is Masechtot. I'm quoting now from the Artscroll Mishna. The tractate Sotah deals with the laws of a married woman who is suspected of committing adultery. A Sotah, plural Sotot, is an adulteress or a woman who is under legal suspicion of being an adulteress. Once it has been established that a woman has committed adultery, she is prohibited by Torah law to continue to live with her husband, and he must divorce her. This is once she's established that adultery has taken place. She is also liable to the death penalty if her adultery was attested by 2 witnesses, as is the man with whom she sinned. However, as in all capital offenses, the death penalty can only be imposed if she was first warned by the witnesses that her act was prohibited and subject to the death penalty. And that establishes the notion that she was doing this fully knowledgeable and intentionally 100%. If 2 witnesses saw her commit adultery but did not properly warn her beforehand, the death penalty cannot be imposed, but she is prohibited to return to her husband and she must be divorced. How is adultery established? Generally speaking, the Torah requires that evidence be established in a court of law on the basis of the testimony of at least 2 witnesses. Thus, if 2 witnesses testify that they saw an act of adultery being committed, the woman is established as a Sotah Vadai, a definite Sotah. Do not think that these witnesses, when it says established, these witnesses are cross-questioned. And in the Talmud and in the Mishnah, they discuss the process of cross-questioning, which includes what time of day it took, what day of the month it happened, and all kinds of questions and details to establish the veracity of the witnesses and the testimony. However, it is also possible for a woman to attain the status of a Sotah and be prohibited to her husband, even though there is no definite proof that she committed adultery. This second type of Sotah is a woman whose fidelity has been questioned by her husband as a result of her immoral behavior and who has met other criteria, making it presumptive that an act of adultery did take place. Such a Sotah is known as a Sotah Safek. The word Safek means doubtful, and their translation is presumptive Sotah. These laws are given by the Torah in Numbers chapter 5, and this tractate deals primarily with this type of Sotah. In order for a woman to become a presumptive Sotah, two events must take place. One, kinui. Kinui means jealousy. That's how it's translated. But the way the Mishnah applies that notion is warning. That is how they are translating that. And if I had not seen what I'm reading to you now, I never would have realized that kinui, because lakanot is to kin'ah, is jealousy, and that's how it's translated. But in Jewish law and application, it means warning, meaning her husband must warn her not to seclude herself with a specific man. And two, stira, seclusion. The wife then disregards the warning and is observed going into seclusion with that man. Once these two events occur, there is sufficient circumstantial evidence to establish the likelihood that an act of adultery has taken place and to forbid her to live with her husband until her innocence can be established. Since those witnessing her seclusion cannot say whether she actually committed adultery or not, the Torah sets forth tests to divinely determine such a woman's innocence or guilt. This test is described in Numbers 5:11. This is the passage that we're actually reading. We're a little bit beyond that by verse 11, but 11 through 31, so we're in the midst of this test, and is explained at length. It tells you just in the Mishnah, chapters 2 and 3 of this tractate. As a first step, the husband and wife go to the court of their city to determine whether she is indeed subject to the Sotah test. If it is so determined, the husband takes his wife to the Sanhedrin, the high court in Jerusalem, where the judges attempt to elicit a confession from her. If she is indeed guilty, if she persists in her claim of innocence, she is then brought before the Kohen in the temple, where the Kohen would prepare the mayim hamarim, the bitter waters, for the woman to drink in order to ascertain her status. These bitter waters were prepared by taking water from the kior, the laver, and we just read about that in the text, the laver, a holy vessel used in the temple for sanctification purposes. Basically, it was there for the priests to wash their hands and their feet before they would perform any service. It was an act of purification. Together, so they would take water from this kior, from this laver, together with soil from the floor of the sanctuary, and mixing the two in an earthenware vessel. The Kohen would then read aloud to the Sotah the passage in the Torah which describes the terrible fate that befalls the Sotah after drinking the bitter waters if she did indeed commit adultery. Hence they are called bitter waters, for they have the potential to cause a bitter end. The Kohen writes down the Torah portion he has just read on a scroll and dips it into the earthenware vessel containing the water prepared by the Kohen. If she is guilty of adultery, she dies a terrible death, as described in the Torah. If she is innocent, she remains alive, is permitted to return to her husband and is blessed with beautiful offspring. It should be noted that the woman is not required to drink, but may simply admit her guilt for which she could not be executed on the basis of her own confession, or simply refuse to drink and accept a divorce. The test is used only if she protests her innocence and wishes to remain with her husband. Furthermore, the test of the bitter waters is administered only if there is doubt as to her guilt. But if her guilt is established on the basis of witnesses, she does not drink, but is divorced or executed if she had been properly warned, as explained above. Moreover, after it has been established that she was warned by her husband and then secluded herself anyway, the testimony of even one witness is sufficient to establish her guilt and require her divorce, although she could not be executed on this basis. This is in contrast to the general rule that matters relating to marital status can only be established on the basis of the testimony of two witnesses. And that is the end of this introduction. Double. So I would hope and think that there is enough information that I have given you that there may well be some questions or comments. So I open it to you now to comment and question.
I think it's interesting that the translator there decided to translate safek as presumptive.
Yes.
Because it's kind of the opposite. Presumptive is the opposite of safek because it's in the area of doubt, but presumptive is closer to yes, and safek is closer to no, at least in my mind.
So the opposite of safek is vadai, and vadai means certain. And that's why I think that it's a legitimate sort of legal expression that there's enough circumstantial evidence to assume that it may have taken place. And I think that if it were in fact fully doubtful, they would not be going through this at all. So I think I'm comfortable with that translation. But the opposite of safek is vadai, at least within halacha. So my feeling was, as I'm reading this, of course, I think of the, because of our culture being so different, that, and of course, these days we do not practice polygamy. The context in which this is being given is polygamy. And that's why, the argument is, well, what if a man did this, right? So a man is not, at least according to Torah law, isn't put through this particular test. And I think, I'm not here to justify, or I'm here to try and explain and to share and to give information. But adultery, the issue was the status of the woman. And so if the woman was married, then there was the issue of adultery. And I believe that the deeper issue has to do with children, the status of the children, and the fact that the woman bears the child, that it has to do with that. And that given the idea, I think this is deeply involved with the issues of purity, which we know is a great issue. We are not affected by it. At least I should say that we are not generally concerned about it, generally. But I'm absolutely convinced that purity and immortality actually go hand in hand. I will tell you also, the introduction did not mention it, but at a certain point, sadly, and this is very early on in our history, the level of immorality got to a point where they ceased to use this at all. I mean, they don't do this these days. First of all, we don't have a temple, so can't do it. But even in a time when the temple existed and where potentially they could have actually performed this ceremony, they didn't, because it was going on too much. And of course, the question, I think, pragmatically for us is what our moral standards are these days. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, we should be executing people and things like that. And even back then, which I hope you were picking up, is that there were all kinds of safeguards as to whether or not anybody was actually executed for doing these sorts of things. My own sense of this as to how I try to absorb and accept and be open is that it's a way of the Torah expressing in other cases as well, that when it talks about capital offenses that in a way come against our own sort of sense of what's right and wrong, that it's a way of the Torah saying, you may not think this is very important, but it is. And you may not think that it affects your life in profound kinds of ways, but it does. And to try and keep us, the idea is not to go around executing people. You know, this isn't a Spanish Inquisition. There's no delight in this happening. It's a sad commentary in some ways on human behavior. But the Torah is trying so hard to get us to live at our greatest potential, and that even though I'm not saying this may not have ever happened, but I will tell you that it says, and this is of course 2,000 years ago or thereabouts, saying that any Sanhedrin, by the way, I think it had to be a court, trying to think, unfortunately, when I use it or lose it, but it had a court, I think, of 32, if I'm not mistaken, to actually try a capital case. 23 judges. Yeah, I think it was 23 judges to try a capital case. 23 judges. And basically they said any Sanhedrin that actually executed someone got the term murderous Sanhedrin, that it was known as that. It got that reputation. So everything was done to try and protect the sanctity of a person's life. But the whole criminal justice system, as you know, is a deep and complicated issue in terms of human behavior, and given the potential of human beings and every one of us. And in some ways, it's a necessary and sad commentary. So, any other, please feel free to comment. And tomorrow I will plan, God willing, to get back into the text. Any other comments? Otherwise, I will just go ahead and we'll close the lesson for now. Thoughts? Gone? All right. I'll stop there.